Section 9 of About Orchids, a Chat. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Yearsley. About Orchids, a Chat by Frederick Boyle. Chapter 6. Hot Orchids. Part 1. In former chapters I have done my best to show that orchid culture is no mystery. The laws which govern it are strict and simple, easy to define in books, easily understood, and subject to few exceptions. It is not with odontoglossums and dendrobes as with roses. An intelligent man or woman needs no long apprenticeship to master their treatment. Stove orchids are not so readily dealt with, but then persons who own a stove usually keep a gardener. Coming from the hot lowlands of either hemisphere, they show much greater variety than those of the temperate and subtropic zones. There are more genera, though not so many species, and more exceptions to every rule. These, therefore, are not to be recommended to all householders. Not everyone, indeed, is anxious to grow plants which need a minimum night heat of 60 degrees in winter, 70 degrees in summer, and cannot dispense with fire the whole year round. The hottest of all orchids, probably, is Peristeria elata, the famous Spirito Santo, flower of the Holy Ghost. The dullest soul who observes that white dove rising with wings half spread, as in the very act of taking flight, can understand the frenzy of the Spaniards when they came upon it. Rumours of Peruvian magnificence had just reached them at Panama, on the same day perhaps, when this miraculous sign from heaven encouraged them to advance. The empire of the Incas did not fall a prey to that particular band of ruffians, nevertheless. Peristeria elata is so well known that I would not dwell upon it, but an odd little tale rises to my mind. The great collector Yearsley was travelling homeward in 1868 by Panama. The railway fare to Colon was $60 at that time, and he grudged the money. Setting his wits to work, Yearsley discovered that the company issued tickets from station to station at a very low price for the convenience of its employees. Taking advantage of this system, he crossed the isthmus for $5. Such an advantage it is in travelling to be an old campaigner. At one of the intermediate stations he had to wait for his train, and rushed into the jungle, of course. Peristeria abounded in that steaming swamp, but the collector was on holiday. To his amazement, however, he found, side by side with it, a Masdevallia, that genus most impatient of sunshine among all orchids, flourishing here in the hottest blaze. Snatching up half a dozen of the tender plants with a practised hand, he brought them safe to England. On the day they were put up to auction, news of Livingstone's death arrived, and in a flash of inspiration Yearsley christened his novelty Masdevallia livingstoniana. Few, indeed, even among authorities, know where that rarest of Masdevallias has its home. None have reached Europe since. A pretty flower it is, white, rosy-tipped, with yellow tails, and it dwells by the station of Culebras on the Panama Railway. Of genera, however, doubtless the Vandas are hottest, and among these Vanda sanderiana stands first. It was found in Mindanao, the most southerly of the Philippines, by Mr. Robelin, when he went thither in search of the red Phalaenopsis, as will be told presently. Vanda sanderiana is a plant to be described as majestic rather than lovely, if we may distinguish among these glorious things. Its blooms are 5 inches across, pale lilac in their ground colour, suffused with brownish yellow, and covered with a network of crimson brown. 12 or more of such striking flowers to a spike, and 4 or 5 spikes upon a plant, make a wonder indeed. But to view matters prosaically, Vanda sanderiana is bad business. It is not common, and it grows on the very top of the highest trees, which must be felled to secure the treasure, and of those gathered but a small proportion survive. In the first place, the agent must employ natives, who are paid so much per plant, no matter what the size. A bad system, but they will allow no change. It is evidently their interest to divide any specimen that will bear cutting up. If the fragments bleed to death, they have got their money meantime. Then the Manila steamers call at Mindanao only once a month. 3 months are needed to get together plants enough to yield a fair profit. At the end of that time, a large proportion of those first gathered will certainly be doomed. Vandas have no pseudo-bulbs to sustain their strength. Steamers run from Manila to Singapore every fortnight. If the collector be fortunate, he may light upon a captain willing to receive his packages. In that case he builds structures of bamboo on deck, and spends the next fortnight in watering, shading, and ventilating his precious trouvailles alternately. But captains willing to receive such freight must be waited for too often. At Singapore it is necessary to make a final overhauling of the plants, to their woeful diminution. This done, troubles recommence. Seldom will the captain of a mail steamer accept that miscellaneous cargo. Happily the time of year is, or ought to be, that season when tea ships arrive at Singapore. The collector may reasonably hope to secure a passage in one of these, which will carry him to England in 35 days or so. If this state of things be pondered, even without allowance for accident, it will not seem surprising that Vanda sanderiana is a costly species. The largest piece yet secured was bought by Sir Trevor Lawrence at auction for 90 guineas. It had 8 stems, the tallest 4 feet high. No consignment has yet returned a profit, however. The favoured home of Vandas is Java. They are noble plants, even when at rest, if perfect, that is, clothed in their glossy dark green leaves from base to crown. If there be any age or any height at which the lower leaves fall of necessity, I have not been able to identify it. In Mr. Sander's collection, for instance, there is a giant plant of Vanda suavis, 11 growths, a small thicket, established in 1847. The tallest stem measures 15 feet, and every one of its leaves remain. They fall off easily under bad treatment, but the mischief is repairable at a certain sacrifice. The stem may be cut through, and the crown replanted, with leaves perfect, but it will be so much shorter, of course. The finest specimen I ever heard of is the Vanda Lowii at Ferrières, seat of Baron Alphonse de Rothschild, near Paris. It fills the upper part of a large greenhouse, and year by year its 12 stems produce an indefinite number of spikes, 8 to 10 feet long, covered with thousands of yellow and brown blooms. Footnote: Vanda Lowii is properly called Renanthera Lowii. End footnote. Vandas inhabit all the Malayan archipelago. Some are found even in India. The superb Vanda teres comes from Sylhet, from Burma also. This might be called the floral cognizance of the house of Rothschild. At Frankfurt, Vienna, Ferrières, and Gunnersbury, little meadows of it are grown. That is, the plants flourish at their own sweet will, uncumbered with pots, in houses devoted to them. Rising from a carpet of palms and maidenhair, each crowned with its drooping garland of rose and crimson and cinnamon brown, they make a glorious show indeed. A pretty little coincidence was remarked when the Queen paid a visit to Waddesdon the other day. Vanda teres first bloomed in Europe at Sion House, and a small spray was sent to the young princess, unmarried then and uncrowned. The incident recurred to memory when Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild chose this same flower for the bouquet presented to Her Majesty. He adorned the luncheon table therewith besides. This story bears a moral. The plant of which one spray was a royal gift less than 60 years ago has become so far common that it may be used in masses to decorate a room. Thousands of unconsidered subjects of Her Majesty enjoy the pleasure which one great duke monopolized before her reign began. There is matter for an essay here. I hasten back to my theme. Vanda teres is not such a common object that description would be superfluous. It belongs to the small class of climbing orchids, delighting to sun itself upon the rafters of the hottest stove. If this habit be duly regarded, it is not difficult to flower by any means, though gardeners who do not keep pace with their age still pronounce it a hopeless rebel. Sir Hugh Lowe tells me that he clothed all the trees round Government House at Pahang with Vanda teres, planting its near relative Vanda hookeri, more exquisite still if that were possible, in a swampy hollow. His servants might gather a basket of these flowers daily in the season. So the memory of the first president for Pahang will be kept green. A plant rarely seen is Vanda limbata from the island of Timor, dusky yellow, the tip purple, outlined with white, formed like a shovel. I may cite a personal reminiscence here, in the hope that some reader may be able to supply what is wanting. In years so far back that they seem to belong to a previous existence, I travelled in Borneo and paid a visit to the antimony mines of Bidi. The manager, Mr. Bentley, showed me a grand tepong tree at his door, from which he had lately gathered a blue orchid. We were desperately vague about names in the jungle at that day, or in England for that matter. In a note published on my return, I said, "As Mr. Bentley described it, the blossoms hung in an azure garland from the bough, more gracefully than art could design." This specimen is, I believe, the only one at present known, and both Malays and Dyaks are quite ignorant of such a flower. What was this? There is no question of the facts. Mr. Bentley sent the plant, a large mass, to the chairman of the company, and it reached home in fair condition. I saw the warm letter enclosing cheque for £100, in which Mr. Templar acknowledged receipt, but further record I have not been able to discover. One inclines to assume that a blue orchid which puts forth a garland of bloom must be a Vanda. The description might be applied to Vanda caerulea, but that species is a native of the Cassia Hills. More appropriately, as I recall Mr. Bentley's words, to Vanda caerulescens, which, however, is Burmese. Furthermore, neither of these would be looked for on the branch of a great tree. Possibly someone who reads this may know what became of Mr. Templar's specimen. Both the species of Renanthera need great heat. Among facts not generally known to orchid growers, but decidedly interesting for them, is the commercial habitat, as one may say, of Renanthera coccinea. The books state correctly that it is a native of Cochin China. Orchids coming from such a distance must needs be withered on arrival. Accordingly, the most experienced horticulturist, who is not up to a little secret, feels assured that all is well when he beholds at the auction room or at one of the small dealers a plant full of sap, with glossy leaves and unshrivelled roots. It must have been in cultivation for a year at the very least, and he buys with confidence. Too often, however, a disastrous change sets in from the very moment his purchase reaches home. Instead of growing, it falls back and back, until in a very few weeks it has all the appearance of a newly imported piece. The explanation is curious. At some time not distant, a quantity of Renanthera coccinea must have found its way to the neighbourhood of Rio. There it flourishes as a weed, with a vigour quite unparalleled in its native soil. Unscrupulous persons take advantage of this extraordinary accident. From a country so near and so readily accessible, they can get plants home, pot them up, and sell them before the withering process sets in. May this revelation confound such knavish tricks. The moral is old. Buy your orchids from one of the great dealers, if you do not care to establish them yourself. Renanthera coccinea is another of the climbing species, and it demands, even more urgently than Vanda teres, to reach the top of the house, where sunshine is fiercest, before blooming. Under the best conditions, indeed, it is slow to produce its noble wreaths of flower, deep red, crimson, and orange. Upon the other hand, the plant itself is ornamental, and it grows very fast. The Duke of Devonshire has some at Chatsworth, which never fail to make a gorgeous show in their season, but they stand 20 feet high, twisted round birch trees, and they have occupied their present quarters for half a century or near it. There is but one more species in the genus, so far as the unlearned know, but this, generally recognized as Vanda Lowii, as has been already mentioned, ranks among the grand curiosities of botanic science. Like some of the catasetums and cycnoches, it bears two distinct types of flower on each spike. But the instance of Renanthera Lowii is even more perplexing. In those other cases the differing forms represent male and female sex, but the microscope has not yet discovered any sort of reason for the like eccentricity of this Renanthera. Its proper inflorescence, as one may put it, is greenish yellow, blotched with brown, 3 inches in diameter, clothing a spike sometimes 12 feet long. The first two flowers to open, however, those at the base, present a strong contrast in all respects. Smaller, of different shape, tawny yellow in colour, dotted with crimson. It would be a pleasing task for ingenious youth with a bent towards science to seek the utility of this arrangement. Orchids are spreading fast over the world in these days, and we may expect to hear of other instances where a species has taken root in alien climes, like Renanthera coccinea in Brazil. I cannot cite a parallel at present, but Mr. Sander informs me that there is a growing demand for these plants in realms which have their own native orchids. We have an example in the letter which has been already quoted. Among customers who write to him direct are magnates of China and Siam, an Indian and a Javanese Raja. Orders are received, not unimportant nor infrequent, from merchants at Calcutta, Singapore, Hong Kong, Rio de Janeiro, and smaller places, of course. It is vastly droll to hear that some of these gentlemen import species at a great expense, which an intelligent coolie could gather for them in any quantity within a few furlongs of their go-down. But, for the most part, they demand foreigners. The plants thus distributed will be grown in the open air. Naturally they will seed. At least, we may hope so. Even Angræcum sesquipedale, of which I wrote in the preceding chapter, would find a moth able to impregnate it in South Brazil. Such species as recognize the conditions necessary for their existence will establish themselves. It is fairly safe to credit that in some future time, not distant, Cattleyas may flourish in the jungles of India, Dendrobiums on the Amazons, Phalaenopsis in the coastlands of Central America. Those who wish well to their kind would like to hasten that day. Mr. Burbage suggested at the Orchid Conference that gentlemen who have plantations in a country suitable should establish a farm, or rather a market garden, and grow the precious things for exportation. It is an excellent idea, and when tea, coffee, sugar cane, all the regular crops of the East and West Indies, are so depreciated by competition, one would think that some planters might adopt it. Perhaps some have. It is too early yet for results. Upon inquiry I hear of a case, but it is not encouraging. One of Mr. Sander's collectors, marrying when on service in the United States of Colombia, resolved to follow Mr. Burbage's advice. He set up his farm and began hybridizing freely. No man living is better qualified as a collector, for the hero of this little tale is Mr. Kerbach, a name familiar among those who take interest in such matters. But I am not aware that he had any experience in growing orchids. To start with hybridizing seems very ambitious, too much of a short cut to fortune. However, in less than 18 months Mr. Kerbach found it did not answer, for reasons unexplained, and he begged to be reinstated in Mr. Sander's service. It is clear indeed that the orchid farmer of the future, in whose success I firmly believe, will be wise to begin modestly, cultivating the species he finds in his neighbourhood. It is not in our greenhouses alone that these plants sometimes show likes and dislikes beyond explanation. For example, many gentlemen in Costa Rica, a wealthy land and comparatively civilized, have tried to cultivate the glorious Cattleya dowiana. For business purposes also the attempt has been made, but never with success. In those tropical lands a variation of climate or circumstances, small perhaps, but such as plants that subsist mostly upon air can recognise, will be found in a very narrow circuit. We say that Trichopilias have their home at Bogota. As a matter of fact, however, they will not live in the immediate vicinity of that town, though the woods 15 miles away are stocked with them. The orchid farmer will have to begin cautiously, propagating what he finds at hand, and he must not be hasty in sending his crop to market. It is a general rule of experience that plants brought from the forest and established before shipment do less well than those shipped direct in good condition, though the public naturally is slow to admit a conclusion opposed by a priori reasoning. The cause may be that they exhaust their strength in that first effort, and suffer more severely on the voyage. I hear of one gentleman, however, who appears to be cultivating orchids with success. This is Mr. Rand, dwelling on the Rio Negro in Brazil, where he has established a plantation of Behaviour brasiliensis, a new caoutchouc of the highest quality, indigenous to those parts. Some years ago Mr. Rand wrote to Mr. Godseff at St. Albans, begging plants of Vanda sanderiana and other oriental species, which were duly forwarded. In return he dispatched some pieces of a new epidendrum, named in his honour Epidendrum Randii, a noble flower, with brown sepals and petals, the lip crimson, betwixt two large white wings. This and others native to the Rio Negro Mr. Rand is propagating on a large scale in shreds of bamboo, especially a white Cattleya superba, which he himself discovered. It is pleasing to add that by latest reports all the oriental species were thriving to perfection on the other side of the Atlantic. Vandas indeed should flourish where Cattleya superba is at home, or anything else that loves the atmosphere of a kitchen on washing day at midsummer. Though all the Cattleyas, or very nearly all, will do in an intermediate house, several prefer the stove. Of two among them, Cattleya dowiana and C. aurea, I spoke in the preceding chapter with an enthusiasm that does not bear repetition. Cattleya guttata leopoldi grows upon rocks in the little island of Santa Catarina, Brazil, in company with Loelia elegans and L. purpurata. There the four dwelt in such numbers only 20 years ago that the supply was thought inexhaustible. It has come to an end already, and collectors no longer visit the spot. Cliffs and ravines which men still young can recollect ablaze with colour are as bare now as a stone quarry. Nature had done much to protect her treasures. They flourished mostly in places which the human foot cannot reach. Loelia elegans and Cattleya guttata leopoldi inextricably entwined, clinging to the face of lofty rocks. The blooms of the former are white and mauve, of the latter chocolate brown, spotted with dark red, the lip purple. A wondrous sight that must have been in the time of flowering. It is lost now, probably forever. Natives went down, suspended on a rope, and swept the whole circuit of the island, year by year. A few specimens remain in nooks, absolutely inaccessible, but those happy mortals who possess a bit of Loelia elegans should treasure it, for more are very seldom forthcoming. Loelia elegans statteriana is the finest variety, perhaps. The crimson velvet tip of its labellum is as clearly and sharply defined upon the snow-white surface as pencil could draw. It looks like painting by the steadiest of hands in angelic colour. Cattleya guttata leopoldi has been found elsewhere. It is deliciously scented. I observed a plant at St. Albans lately with 3 spikes, each bearing over 20 flowers. Many strong perfumes there were in the house, but that overpowered them all. The Loelia purpurata of Santa Catarina, to which the finest varieties in cultivation belong, has shared the same fate. It occupied boulders jutting out above the swamps in the full glare of tropic sunshine. Many gardeners give it too much shade. This species grows also on the mainland, but of inferior quality in all respects. Curiously enough, it dwells upon trees there, even though rocks be at hand, while the island variety, I believe, was never found on timber. Another hot Cattleya of the highest class is Cattleya Acklandii. It belongs to the dwarf section of the genus, and inexperienced persons are vastly surprised to see such a little plant bearing 2 flowers on a spike, each larger than itself. They are 4 inches in diameter, petals and sepals chocolate brown, barred with yellow, lip large, of colour varying from rose to purple. Cattleya Acklandii is found at Bahia, where it grows side by side with Cattleya amethystoglossa, also a charming species, very tall, leafless to the tip of its pseudo-bulbs. Thus the dwarf beneath is seen in all its beauty. As they cling together in great masses, the pair must make a flower bed to themselves. Above, the clustered spikes of Cattleya amethystoglossa, dusky lilac, purple spotted, with a lip of amethyst. Upon the ground the rich chocolate and rose of Cattleya Acklandii. Cattleya superba, as has been said, dwells also on the Rio Negro in Brazil. It has a wide range, for specimens have been sent from the Rio Meta in Colombia. This species is not loved by gardeners, who find it difficult to cultivate and almost impossible to flower, probably because they cannot give it sunshine enough. I have heard that Baron Hruby, a Hungarian enthusiast in our science, has no sort of trouble. Wonders indeed are reported of that admirable collection, where all the hot orchids thrive like weeds. The Briton may find comfort in assuming that cool species are happier beneath his cloudy skies. If he be prudent, he will not seek to verify the assumption. The assistant curator of Kew assures us, in his excellent little work Orchids, that the late Mr. Spires grew Cattleya superba well, and he details his method. I myself have never seen the bloom. Mr. Watson describes it as 5 inches across, bright rosy purple suffused with white, very fragrant, lip with acute side lobes folding over the column, making a funnel in short, the front lobe spreading kidney-shaped, crimson purple, with a blotch of white and yellow in front. In the same districts with Cattleya superba grows Galliandra devoniana, under circumstances rather unusual. It clings to the very tip of a slender palm, in swamps which the Indians themselves regard with dread as the chosen home of fever and mosquitoes. It was discovered by Sir Robert Schomburgk, who compared the flower to a foxglove, referring especially perhaps to the graceful bend of its long pseudo-bulbs, which is almost lost under cultivation. The tube-like flowers are purple, contrasting exquisitely with a snow-white lip, striped with lilac in the throat. End of section 9. Section 10 of About Orchids, a Chat. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Yearsley. About Orchids, a Chat. Chapter 6. Hot Orchids. Part 2. Phalaenopsis, of course, are hot. This is one of our oldest genera which still rank in the first class. It was drawn and described so early as 1750, and a plant reached Messrs. Rollison in 1838. They sold it to the Duke of Devonshire for 100 guineas. Many persons regard Phalaenopsis as the loveliest of all, and there is no question of their supreme beauty, though not everyone may rank them first. They come mostly from the Philippines, but Java, Borneo, Cochin China, Burma, even Assam contribute some species. Colonel Berkeley found Phalaenopsis tetraspis, snow white, and Phalaenopsis speciosa, purple, in the Andamans, when he was governor of that settlement, clinging to low bushes along the mangrove creeks. So far as I know, all the species dwell within breath of the sea, as it may be put, where the atmosphere is laden with salt. This gives a hint to the thoughtful. Mr. Partington of Cheshunt, who was the most renowned cultivator of the genus in his time, used to lay down salt upon the paths and beneath the stages of his Phalaenopsis house. Lady Howard de Walden stands first, perhaps, at the present day, and her gardener follows the same system. These plants, indeed, are affected, for good or ill, by influences too subtle for our perception as yet. Experiment alone will decide whether a certain house, or a certain neighbourhood even, is agreeable to their taste. It is a waste of money in general to make alterations. If they do not like the place, they won't live there, and that's flat. It is probable that Maidstone, where Lady Howard de Walden resides, may be specially suited to their needs, but her ladyship's gardener knows how to turn a lucky chance to the best account. Some of his plants have 10 leaves. The uninitiated may think that fact grotesquely undeserving of a note of exclamation, but to explain would be too technical. It may be observed that the famous swan orchid, Cycnoches chlorochilon, flourishes at Maidstone as nowhere else perhaps in England. Phalaenopsis were first introduced by Messrs. Rollison of Tooting, a firm that vanished years ago, but will live in the annals of horticulture as the earliest of the great importers. In 1836 they got home a living specimen of Phalaenopsis amabilis, which had been described and even figured 80 years before. A few months later the Duke of Devonshire secured Phalaenopsis schilleriana. The late Mr. B. S. Williams told me a very curious incident relating to this species. It comes from the Philippines, and exacts a very hot, close atmosphere, of course. Once upon a time, however, a little piece was left in the cool house at Holloway, and remained there some months unnoticed by the authorities. When at length the oversight was remarked, to their amaze this stranger from the tropics, abandoned in the temperate zone, proved to be thriving more vigorously than any of his fellows who enjoyed their proper climate. So he was left in peace and cherished as a phenomenon. 4 seasons had passed when I beheld the marvel, and it was a picture of health and strength, flowering freely. But the reader is not advised to introduce a few Phalaenopsis to his Odontoglossums, not by any means. Mr. Williams himself never repeated the experiment. It was one of those delightfully perplexing vagaries which the orchid grower notes from time to time. There are rare species of this genus which will not be found in the dealers' catalogues, and amateurs who like a novelty may be pleased to hear some names. Phalaenopsis manni, christened in honour of Mr. Mann, director of the Indian Forest Department, is yellow and red. Phalaenopsis cornucurvi, yellow and brown. Phalaenopsis portii, a natural hybrid of Phalaenopsis rosea and Phalaenopsis aphrodite, white, the lip amethyst. It is found very, very rarely in the woods near Manila. Above all, Phalaenopsis sanderiana, to which hangs a little tail. So soon as the natives of the Philippines began to understand that their white and lilac weeds were cherished in Europe, they talked of a scarlet variety, which thrilled listening collectors with joy. But the precious thing never came to hand, and on closer inquiry no responsible witness could be found who had seen it. Years passed by, and the scarlet Phalaenopsis became a jest among orchidaceans. The natives persisted, however, and Mr. Sander found the belief so general, if shadowy, that when a service of coasting steamers was established, he sent Mr. Robelin to make a thorough investigation. His enterprise and sagacity were rewarded, as usual. After floating round for 25 years amidst derision, the rumour proved true in part. Phalaenopsis sanderiana is not scarlet, but purplish rose, a very handsome and distinct species. To the same collector we owe the noblest of Irides, Irides Lawrenceae, waxy white tipped with purple, and deep purple lip. Besides the lovely colouring, it is the largest by far of that genus. Mr. Robelin sent 2 plants from the Far East. He had not seen the flower, nor received any description from the natives. Mr. Sander grew them in equal ignorance for 3 years, and sent one to auction in blossom. It fell to Sir Trevor Lawrence's bid for 235 guineas. Many of the coelogenes classed as cool, which indeed rub along with Odontoglossums, do better in the stove while growing. Coelogenes cristata itself comes from Nepal, where the summer sun is terrible, and it covers the rocks most exposed. But I will only name a few of those recognized as hot. Among the most striking of flowers, exquisitely pretty also, is Coelogenes pandurata from Borneo. Its spike has been described by a person of fine fancy as resembling a row of glossy pea-green frogs with black tongues, each 3 inches in diameter. The whole bloom is brilliantly green, but several ridges clothed with hairs as black and soft as velvet run down the lip, seeming to issue from a mouth. It is strange to see that a plant so curious, so beautiful and so sweet should be so rarely cultivated. I own, however, that it is very unwilling to make itself at home with us. Coelogenes Dayana, also a native of Borneo, one of our newest discoveries, is named after Mr. Day of Tottenham. I may interpolate a remark here for the encouragement of poor but enthusiastic members of our fraternity. When Mr. Day sold his collection lately, an American syndicate paid £12,000 down, and the remaining plants fetched £12,000 at auction. So at least the uncontradicted report goes. Coelogenes Dayana is rare, of course, and dear, but Mr. Sander has lately imported a large quantity. The spike is 3 feet long sometimes, a pendant wreath of buff yellow flowers broadly striped with chocolate. Coelogenes Massangiana, from Assam, resembles this, but the lip is deep crimson brown with lines of yellow, and a white edge. Newest of all the Coelogenes, and supremely beautiful, is Coelogenes Sanderiana, imported by the gentleman whose name it bears. He has been called the Orchid King. This superb species has only flowered once in Europe as yet. Baron Ferdinand Rothschild is the happy man. Its snow-white blooms, 6 on a spike generally, each 3 inches across, have very dark brown stripes on the lip. It was discovered in Borneo by Mr. Forstermann, the same collector who happened upon the wondrous scarlet dendrobe mentioned in a former chapter. There I stated that Baron Schroeder had 3 pieces. This was a mistake, unfortunately. Mr. Forstermann only secured 3, of which 2 died on the journey. Baron Schroeder bought the 3rd, but it has perished. No more can be found as yet. Of Oncidiums there are many that demand stove treatment. The story of Oncidium splendidum is curious. It first turned up in France some 30 years ago. A ship's captain sailing from St. Lazare brought 6 pieces, which he gave to his owner, Monsieur Herman. The latter handed them to Messieurs Thibault and Quetelet of Sceaux, who split them up and distributed them. 2 of the original plants found their way to England, and they also appear to have been cut up. A legend of the King Street auction room recalls how perfervid competitors ran up a bit of Oncidium splendidum that had only 1 leaf to 30 guineas. The whole stock vanished presently, which is not surprising, if it had all been divided in the same ruthless manner. From that day the species was lost, until Mr. Sander turned his attention to it. There was no record of its habitat. The name of the vessel, or even of the captain, might have furnished a clue had it been recorded, for the shipping intelligence of the day would have shown what ports he was frequenting about that time. I could tell of mysterious orchids traced home upon indications less distinct, but there was absolutely nothing. Mr. Sander, however, had scrutinized the plant carefully while specimens were still extant, and from the structure of the leaf he formed a strong conclusion that it must belong to the Central American flora. Furthermore, that it must inhabit a very warm locality. In 1882 he directed one of his collectors, Monsieur Overslees, to look for the precious thing in Costa Rica. Year after year the search proceeded, until Mr. Overslees declared with some warmth that Oncidium splendidum might grow in heaven or in the other place, but it was not to be found in Costa Rica. But theorists are stubborn, and year after year he was sent back. At length, in 1882, riding through a district often explored, the collector found himself in a grassy plain, dotted with pale yellow flowers. He had beheld the same many times, but his business was orchids. On this occasion, however, he chanced to approach one of the masses, and recognized the object of his quest. It was the familiar case of a man who overlooks the thing he has to find, because it is too near and too conspicuous. But Mr. Overslees had excuse enough. Who could have expected to see an Oncidium buried in long grass, exposed to the full power of a tropic sun? Oncidium Lanceanum is perhaps the hottest of its genus. Those happy mortals who can grow it declare they have no trouble. but unless perfectly strong and healthy, it gets the spot and promptly goes to wreck. In the houses of the New Plant and Bulb Company at Colchester, now extinct, Oncidium lanceanum flourished with a vigour almost embarrassing, putting forth such enormous leaves as it hung close to the glass as made blinds quite superfluous at midsummer. But this was an extraordinary case. Certainly it is a glorious spectacle in flower, yellow barred with brown, the lip violet. The spikes last a month in full beauty, sometimes two. An Oncidium which always commands attention from the public and grateful regard from the devotee is Oncidium papilio. Its strange form fascinated the Duke of Devonshire, grandfather to the present, who was almost the first of our lordly amateurs, and tempted him to undertake the explorations which introduced so many fine plants to Europe. The butterfly orchid is so familiar that I do not pause to describe it, but imagine that most interesting flower all blue, instead of gold and brown. I have never been able to learn what was the foundation of the old belief in such a marvel, but the great Lindley went to his grave in unshaken confidence that a blue papilio exists. Once he thought he had a specimen, but it flowered, and his triumph had to be postponed. I myself heard of it 2 years back, and tried to cherish a belief that the news was true. A friend from Natal assured me that he had seen one on the table of the director of the gardens at Durban, but it proved to be one of those terrestrial orchids, so lovely and so tantalizing to us, with which South Africa abounds. Very slowly do we lengthen the catalogue of them in our houses. There are gardeners such as Mr. Cook at Loughborough, who grows Disa grandiflora like a weed. Mr. Watson of Kew demonstrated that Disa racemosa will flourish under conditions easily secured. I had the good fortune to do as much for Disa Cooperi, though not by my own skill. One supreme little triumph is mine, however. In very early days, when animated with the courage of utter ignorance, I bought 8 bulbs of Disa discolor, and flowered them, every one. No mortal in Europe had done it before, nor has any tried since, I charitably hope, for a more rubbishing bloom does not exist. But there it was, ego feci, and the specimen in the herbarium at Kew bears my name. But legends should not be disregarded when it is certain that they reach us from a native source. Some of the most striking finds had been announced long since by observant savages. I have told the story of Phalaenopsis sanderiana. It was a Zulu who put the discoverer of the new yellow calla on the track. The blue utricularia had been heard of and discredited long before it was found. Utricularias are not orchids indeed, but only botanists regard the distinction. The natives of Assam persistently assert that a bright yellow cymbidium grows there, of supremest beauty, and we expect it to turn up one day. The Malagasy describe a scarlet one, but I am digressing. Epidendrums mostly will bear as much heat as can be given them while growing. All demand more sunshine than they can get in our climate. Amateurs do not seem to be so well acquainted with the grand things of this genus as they should be. They distrust all imported epidendrums. Many worthless specimens, indeed, bear a perplexing resemblance to the finest. So much so that the most observant of authorities would not think of buying at the auction room unless he had confidence enough in the seller's honesty to accept his description of a lot. Gloriously beautiful, however, are some of those rarely met with, easy to cultivate also in a sunny place, and not dear. Epidendrum rhizophorum has been lately rechristened Epidendrum radicans, a name which might be confined to the Mexican variety, for the plant recurs in Brazil, practically the same, but with a certain difference. The former grows on shrubs, a true epiphyte. The latter has its bottom roots in the soil, at foot of the tallest trees, and runs up to the very summit, perhaps 150 feet. The flowers also show a distinction, but in effect they are brilliant orange-red, the lip yellow edged with scarlet. 40 or 50 of them hanging in a cluster from the top of the raceme makes a show to remember. Mr. Watson saw a plant a few years ago that bore 86 heads of flowers. They last for 3 months. Epidendrum prismatocarpum also is a lovely thing, with narrow dagger-like sepals and petals, creamy yellow, spotted black, lip mauve or violet edged with pale yellow. Of the many hot Dendrobiums, Australia supplies a good proportion. There is Dendrobium bigibbum, of course, too well known for description. It dwells on the small islands in Torres Straits. This species flowered at Kew so early as 1824, but the plant died. Messrs. Loddiges of Hackney reintroduced it 30 years later. Dendrobium johannis, from Queensland, brown and yellow, streaked with orange, the flowers curiously twisted. Dendrobium superbiens, from Torres Straits, rosy purple, edged with white, lip crimson. Handsomest of all by far is Dendrobium phalaenopsis. It throws out a long slender spike from the tip of the pseudobulb, bearing 6 or more flowers, 3 inches across. The sepals are lance-shaped, and the petals twice as broad, rosy lilac, with veins of darker tint, the lip arched over by its side lobes, crimson lake in the throat, paler and striped at the mouth. It was first sent home by Mr. Forbes of Kew Gardens, from Timor-Laue, in 1880. But Mr. Fitzgerald had made drawings of a species substantially the same, some years before, from a plant he discovered on the property of Captain Bloomfield, Balmain, in Queensland, nearly 1,000 miles south of Timor. Mr. Sander caused search to be made, and he has introduced Mr. Fitzgerald's variety under the name of Dendrobium phalaenopsis statterianum. It is smaller than the type, and crimson instead of lilac. Bulbophyllums rank among the marvels of nature. It is a point comparatively trivial that this genus includes the largest of orchids and perhaps the smallest. Bulbophyllum beccarii has leaves 2 feet long, 18 inches broad. It encircles the biggest tree in one clasp of its rhizomes, which travellers mistake for the coil of a boa constrictor. Furthermore, this species emits the vilest stench known to scientific persons, which is a great saying. But these points are insignificant. The charm of bulbophyllums lies in their machinery for trapping insects. Those who attended the Temple show last year saw something of it, if they could penetrate the crush around Bulbophyllum barbigerum on Sir Trevor Lawrence's stand. This tiny but amazing plant comes from Sierra Leone. The long yellow lip is attached to the column by the slenderest possible joint, so that it rocks without an instant's pause. At the tip is set a brush of silky hairs, which wave backwards and forwards with the precision of machinery. No wonder that the natives believe it is a living thing. The purpose of these arrangements is to catch flies, which other species effect with equal ingenuity, if less elaboration. Very pretty, too, are some of them, as Bulbophyllum lobii. Its clear, clean, orange-creamy hue is delightful to behold. The lip, so delicately balanced, quivers at every breath. If the slender stem be bent back, as by a fly alighting on the column, that quivering cap turns and hangs imminent. Another tiny shake, as though the fly approached the nectary, and it falls plump, head over heels, like a shot, imprisoning the insect. Thus the flower is impregnated. If we wished to excite a thoughtful child's interest in botany, not regardless of the sense of beauty either, we would make an investment in Bulbophyllum lobii. Bulbophyllum dearii also is pretty, golden ochre, spotted red, with a wide dorsal sepal, very narrow petals flying behind, lower sepals broadly striped with red, and a yellow lip, upon a hinge of course. But the gymnastic performances of this species are not so impressive as in most of its kin. A new Bulbophyllum, B. godseffianum, has lately been brought from the Philippines, contrived on the same principle, but even more charming. The flowers, 2 inches broad, have the colour of old gold, with stripes of crimson on the petals, and the dorsal sepal shows membranes almost transparent, which have the effect of silver embroidery. Until Bulbophyllum beccarii was introduced from Borneo in 1867, the Grammatophyllums were regarded as monsters incomparable. Mr. Arthur Caser, resident magistrate at Selangor in the Straits Settlement, tells of one which he gathered on a durian tree, 7 feet 2 inches high, 13 feet 6 inches across, bearing 7 spikes of flower, the longest 8 feet 6 inches, a weight which 15 men could only just carry. Mr. F. W. Burbidge heard a tree fall in the jungle one night when he was 4 miles away, and on visiting the spot he found, right in the collar of the trunk, a grammatophyllum big enough to fill a Pickford's van, just opening its golden brown spotted flowers on stout spikes 2 yards long. It is not to be hoped that we shall ever see monsters like these in Europe. The genus indeed is unruly. Grammatophyllum speciosum has been grown to 6 feet high, I believe, which is big enough to satisfy the modest amateur, especially when it develops leaves 2 feet long. The flowers are, that is, they ought to be, 6 inches in diameter, rich yellow blotched with reddish purple. They have some giants at Kew now, of which fine things are expected. Grammatophyllum mesuresianum, named after Mr. Measures, a leading amateur, is pale buff, speckled with chocolate, the ends of the sepals and petals charmingly tipped with the same hue. Within the last few months Mr. Sander has obtained Grammatophyllum multiflorum from the Philippines, which seems to be not only the most beautiful, but the easiest to cultivate of those yet introduced. Its flowers droop in a garland of pale green and yellow, splashed with brown, not loosely set as is the rule, but scarcely half an inch apart. The effect is said to be lovely beyond description. We may hope to judge for ourselves in no long time, for Mr. Sander has presented a wondrous specimen to the Royal Gardens, Kew. This is assuredly the biggest orchid ever brought to Europe. Its snaky pseudo-bulbs measure 9 feet, and the old flower spikes stood 18 feet high. It will be found in the Victoria Regia house, growing strongly. End of section 10.